in my career, I've done various things. I've been in television, I've run an event company, I've had a production house. And then now for the last many, many years, corporate training and coaching, leadership coaching and behavioral change, personal growth, etc. And when people ask me, what do you do? It's a very loaded question for
Yeah.
me, and it becomes very difficult to give a one-line answer. How is it that you make your peace with all the roles that you're playing? And does it create a conflict in your mind when people ask you, what do you do, Rahul?
No, it's not a conflict when I'm asked. I think to me the conflict is how do I give all of this the kind of time that I would like to give it to. And also the other point is that then what happens to the time that you want to do nothing, right? Because from the nothing also comes a lot of the ideas, right? That's when you have that time to really, really think deeper. But coming to your point about, I learned this interesting thing from a friend of mine who lives in Singapore, and he works for a company that is selling these workspace slash modern boutique hotels to kind of millennials. And he's my age, so I always wanted to slap him because he keeps coming up with these buzzwords which the kids use. And apparently, when you're like a lawyer hyphen something, because that's the cool thing now, on their visiting cards apparently have, so they're called hyphenators. So maybe that's how you should answer this. That
Yeah, I'm a hyphenator.
you're something hyphen something hyphen.
This is a podcast where we unravel, understand, and unbox human behavior through conversations with people who've lived interesting lives, made some unconventional choices, and are committed to living up to their highest potential and helping people in the world. Today, I'm in conversation with someone who has varied interests. He's a restaurateur par excellence with brands like Dhaba, Mamagoto, Sly Granny, more than 45 outlets. He's someone who has an interest in architecture and photography, and he's written a book. He's also a coach, and he's into career coaching and helping SMEs and entrepreneurs grow and do better. I'm in conversation with Rahul Khanna. Welcome, Rahul.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for taking the time out to be here today. So, I think the first thing I want to ask you is that how did you make the transition from the restaurant space to coaching and helping SMEs? Was there an organic progression or it just, happened?
I think a bit of both. I think obviously COVID was that moment where a lot of us had time free, where you could sort of self-reflect, look at what you really wanted to do that you weren't able to do earlier. But having said that, I think even pre-COVID, very often, as is the case in India, right, randomly you'll get phone calls from somebody saying, hey, listen, my son or daughter or, bhanja wants to get into the restaurant business. Can you give them, 10 minutes of your time? And I remember that time because I had been in this situation when I was 18, 19, 20. And I felt like really awkward in those conversations because, whoever you're going to meet is doing you a favor. They're not probably giving you really solicited advice anyway because it's, they don't have much time and nothing really comes out of that conversation. And I just felt the lack of mentoring at an early stage in my career with the restaurants, probably would have helped me had I had a good mentor, would have maybe made me make less bad decisions very early. So when COVID happened, I kind of looked at this idea of, trying to do entrepreneurial coaching, career potential discovery, helping entrepreneurs find their best ways to get potential out of themselves, their teams. And it's more therapeutic, right? This is not business consulting. This is not helping you out of telling you how to make money. This is how do you get better in your own journey as an entrepreneur. So I did this coaching course. It was quite intensive for about 3 months during COVID. And that was really fun. And then I realized that it's a good mix of conversation, psychometric tests, and all of that stuff. So now I'm kind of, in a way, segueing between obviously my day job, which is the restaurant business, but also helping either entrepreneurs or people finding career potential that they're not very clear on. I think that also in COVID, people have realized to a great degree that they weren't enjoying what the work they were in. And I think because they had that involuntary reflection time.
Yeah, I think
that
a
kind
lot of us
yeah.
went through that. So, you mentioned COVID, and I know it was a tough time for so many people on various fronts, financially, emotionally. People lost friends, family. But it was also a time when, pivoting became a buzzword. But I think, jokes apart, I think people did reflect and figure out how they want to go forward with their lives. At least, some people did. How tough was COVID from as a restaurateur, because you have more than 700 employees,
Yeah.
45 outlets.
Yeah.
How did you manage during the pandemic?
I think there was a big difference, I think, between COVID 1 and 2. I think for one, because everybody, whether you're in the restaurant business or whichever business, or even if you're not in a business, I think that was just completely unseen. I think it was like a World War II moment, right? No one had experienced anything like this since possibly partition, in terms of like a moment where you can draw a line in history to say, okay, where were you when this happened, right? So I think in that case, with us, I think the first thing was, what do we do? And see, we're a private equity invested business, right? So luckily for us, to a degree, there was a little bit of bandwidth where, okay, we could go back to investors, say, listen, guys, what do we do here? There's a fork in the road. How do we navigate this? So there was, I wouldn't say a lot of help there, but there was some guidance and a little bit of financial aid, because obviously there was no real aid coming from elsewhere. And then the other problem that we wanted to face immediately was, what do you do with at least the real bottom rung employees, right? The guys who don't have any option but to go home, because their livelihoods, the guys who wash the dishes, who cook and clean, who are at lower salaries, minimum wage. Those are the ones that we were most sort of worried for. And a lot of things we didn't foresee. So for example, let's say at Mamagoto, at least 15-20% of our kitchen brigade is from Nepal. And for them, it was also a cross-border thing, like how do you send them home and then how do you bring them back in? So that became a big challenge, and then, so I think a lot of it just went into a lot of Zoom calls, with just figuring out how do we look after them, and then figuring out how do you start to, as you said, pivot. So obviously home delivery became a thing. We started doing a retail line, those home cooking kits, a lot of that stuff happened. But was also interesting was also just to see, I think, everyone's tenacity, right? I think that also comes to the fore, because a lot of those people who we felt would not come to work right in the middle of the pandemic, they're happy to come, literally risking their lives. Not just with the pandemic. I think we had even situations where some of our housekeeping boys would get into, their scooters and whatever to come to work, and they'd be stopped by cops and beaten up because it was curfew, even though they had their passes. So as it is, they're risking their lives with the virus. So there was a lot of that. So it was very tough. Obviously, some people, and to me, it was weird because I believe myself to be a student of Stoicism. I've always felt like it's all about your reactions. That's the only thing you can control, right? But when you see others really, really fighting at the bottom of the tank, it's tough for them to look at Stoicism, because
It's about survival.
it's about survival, right? So I think that's the part where we were. And then we also work with a charity called Project Y. And then, we had to work with them because we helped their school kids. So sending them food. So all of it was good. It was quite heroic in a way, and everybody comes together. I think the good thing is, you're in it together. I think that was one thing that COVID taught us, right?
It did bring a lot of us together. Yeah.
There was less bickering, there was less debate, less discussion on those calls. And there was more like, okay, guys, solution. So I, in fact, remind my team now that, can we go back into COVID thinking that, at least let's go back into thinking about solutions first, because very often,
so often people in organizations at home, we're so quick to point problems and issues, and it's fine and it's important to recognize problems and issues, but when you discuss an issue, it's so important to at least come with a solution or a possible solution. That makes the whole conversation positive and proactive and productive, instead of coming in and just saying, okay, let's hash out the problem, and then we're only discussing problem, and there are no solutions.
No, for sure. I always say that COVID was a crash course in lateral thinking for everybody. Like whoever didn't want to think, because they always felt like we as founders will have the answers to everything. And we would look at them and say, listen, guys, whereas this is concerned, we don't. Like, we need your thoughts and yours, and you at the back over there too, who never speaks. This is the time to talk, right? So there was a lot of ingenious thinking, a lot of creative thinking, a lot of quick thinking. And that's why I keep reminding them, as I said earlier, that, come back to that way of being, why do we need a pandemic for us to think, laterally, or think creatively, or think out of the box? Why can't this become just a way of being culturally?
I completely agree with you. And this is a question I have, I'm as a coach, as a trainer, this is a question I'm asked often enough, where a friend or a client will come up and say that, my brother or my best friend or my husband is so unhappy, but they refuse to change. And I keep telling them, I said, everyone has to hit their version of rock bottom,
Yeah.
or some watershed moment has to happen where you are pushed to a point where either you give up or you then change.
Yeah.
And I think you only change when you want to, and the pandemic kind of pushed us to a point where we were forced to rethink. But I think it's up to us to hold on to, like you said, the learnings of the pandemic or from the pandemic.
Yeah, I think because we also then as humans have, selective memory, right?
Yeah,
Some
I
things
know.
we'll hold on forever, some things we'll forget tomorrow, right? So I think the key now is what are those lessons and how are you able to kind of learn from them going forward. So I think, yeah, it's going to be interesting because I think also it's made us a lot more stubborn now. If you look at the current slight, let's say last few weeks, there was a little bit of COVID coming back. A lot of people we know have it. But I think just the reaction of it has been so muted because I think people also have risen to that occasion to say, you know what, we now know what this monster is and it's easier to contend with it. So I think there's a lot of that. But you're right. I think with rock bottom, I think it's been quite cathartic to a lot of people to even find their rock bottom because very
Otherwise,
often you're just in
stuck in that limbo.
yeah, you're just spinning and then you're not realizing that you're coming closer to the bottom. But I think this kind of gave people a good realization to say, you know what,
True.
I can restart and reinvent or pivot or whatever you want to call it, right?
I want you to talk a little bit more about it because I also believe that an event happens, then there's your reaction to that event, which actually influences the outcome. It's not that this happened to me and hence that happened. There's your reaction, which can change the equation.
Yeah, I mean, see, at a macro level, and I think sometimes this kind of makes people wonder about their significance, right? Because on a daily basis, we give ourselves so much importance about a certain deal we want to do or a certain pair of shoes we should buy or whatever it could be, right? It could be very trivial. But a lot of this says that you're basically a speck of dust in the galaxy, right? So stop caring so much about the everyday. That doesn't mean that you don't care, it just means that you have to create a certain arm's length with a lot of what you assume to be very serious because nothing will ever become that big for you to create such a massive moment in your life, which is all fictional technically, right? So I think I don't know. For me, it's sometimes it's just a reminder mechanism. Of course, there are days where I will react extremely strangely or negatively to certain things, or I lose my temper like anybody else, right? Everyone's got faults, but it's just a good way for me to kind of keep an anchor to say, okay, could I have dealt with this better? And was I taking myself too seriously, or the conversation too seriously, or the moment too seriously? Because, like, I also read this is the very interesting part, right? That you normally die 3 times. One is when you get your last breath, one is when you get buried, and the third is when your name is taken for the last time. So if you're lucky, let's say if you're Mandela or Julius Caesar, we're still talking about you, right? But if it's you and me, we'll be lucky even if our great grandchildren will mention our name on a dinner table, right? And that's when you truly disappear. So at best, we'll be another 100, 120 years will be spoken of. And they might say, wo kaun the us photo mein, kind of thing, right? And that's the last time your name's ever taken. So again, why are we giving ourselves that much importance when we're quite transient? And it's good to then realize that your reaction should also be as equatable, where you're not overbearing to yourself. I don't know if I'm making sense, but the two
No,
kind of
completely.
make sense to me.
No, I think makes complete sense because very rarely is the problem the problem. How you think about the problem is the real problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And even like in the restaurant business, whenever we do like complaint handling training with some of the junior staff, like I always tell them it's not the complaint itself that irritates the guest, right? It's how you deal with the complaint. Because very often, if you're not matching their level of human emotion, if you're either, treating it very, very casually or, that's what irks people more. So similarly, even like you said rightly about, let's say, these reactions, it's about not what's happening. Like tomorrow, even something as simple as a traffic jam can have the same reaction to you, being in a much more serious situation, but your reaction might be the same. Your blood pressure would be the same. And you realize only later that, you're reacting extremely obliviously to what you should have. And that's where you have to sort of keep training the mind. And, it's tough, but that's at least some mantra you need to work with, right?
So this awareness that you have obviously comes from stuff you've read, your experiences, but was it this sort of energy, thought process that got you interested in coaching and training, or was it something else?
Um, I don't know actually. I think initially it was more about just wanting to do something that was purely, at least the coaching bit and the career potential discovery bit was more about trying to find something that would help me balance my current work. So my current work has a million variables, right? It's very people driven. It's very basis on, today my chef may leave, or tomorrow the suppliers won't come on time, or the AC is not working, or the mall has shut because of, an election. So you're always reliant on, others to make your life work. Whereas I wanted to do something where I'm reliant on my own intellectual capital and possibly an internet connection, and that's it. And maybe one accountant to sort of do my bills for me. But so I wanted to kind of, in a way, pivot, even not just from a work angle, but even psychologically pivot, right? So that I know that there are these two very complete extremes then, where, as and when I feel I can retreat to this coaching bit, which is extremely self-sufficient. And then when I feel, I need that madness and chaos of the restaurant business, which is also a lot of
own
fun.
Energy and
yeah,
adrenaline,
it's massively creative. I can do a lot of me comes there also. I love interior design, I love architecture, I love food. A lot of me is also there. So it kind of helps me straddle the two and kind of, hopscotch from one to the other as and when I can, hopefully.
Yeah,
That was the
you
idea
brought up
behind
your
it.
interest in architecture. You've written a book. You're a photographer. Modern Architecture of Delhi.
Yes.
How did that come about? And was it
So
an easy project?
no, it was actually, I was very lucky. The school I studied hospitality, and it's in Lausanne in Switzerland. And at the time, we always used to complain to our professors, but they would teach us various subjects completely unrelated to hospitality. So we learned ethics and cultural diversity and architecture, and they kept arguing with us that, we're making you worldly. And we're like, what does that really mean?
Yeah, and as students, you turn around and say, "Listen,
Yeah.
dude, just let's get
So,
to the
yeah.
real
So
stuff."
when we learned architecture, and because we were very well situated, in like 4 hours you could be in Paris or Milan, or you could drive anywhere from Switzerland. So it was fun because I started realizing that I really liked the idea of identifying buildings, and in a way you can talk to them because you know when they were built and what the styles were. So that was interesting. And when I came back to Delhi after many years, I wanted to see if there's any modernist architecture, and to my surprise there was a lot of this stuff that Nehru kind of brought back. So that was really fun because a lot of the architects, some of them were still alive. There was Man Singh Rana, there was I think Charles Correa was alive at the time. So I got to meet a lot of them and interview a lot of them, and kind of also get their stories of what was happening in India. And also some great photographers, like Madan Mata is a phenomenal photographer who people just assume was this wedding photography studio in Connaught Place, but he has like the unbelievable archive of Indian modernism, which luckily now is given its due, I think, with a lot of galleries, etc. And and Manav was the photographer of the book. I got to know him because of the book. And now to this day are very good friends. So yeah, it was very fun. It was a lot of fun. And every morning we'd shoot the buildings, and we were very lucky because this was right before, I think, 26/11. Otherwise, no way we would have got access to half of these buildings. So I think our timing was great because we had to shoot a lot of embassies and things like that. So yeah, I think I was very young when it was published. I think I was about 26. So looking back, I think, of course, you always feel you could do better.
I think that always remains.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's fun, and I think it's still available in some bookstores here and there. I saw it in an airport in Chennai the other day, so I was quite kicked.
That's quite exciting.
Somehow it's still living its life, yeah.
So I'm going to ask you a completely random question, you might think, but it's a question I've struggled with. So I think I'm asking it more for my understanding. So in my career, I've done various things. I've been in television, I've run an event company, I've had a production house, I've gotten a wedding planning at one point. And then now for the last many, many years, corporate training and coaching, leadership coaching and behavioral change, personal growth, etc. And when people ask me, what do you do? It's a very loaded question for me, and it becomes very difficult to give a one-line answer because a lot of people say, oh, I'm, CEO of this,
and that's
or
it,
I'm
right?
senior vice president of this, or I'm a chartered accountant. And I've always struggled to answer that question simply. and you've got all of these things that you're doing. How is it that you make your peace with all the roles that you're playing, and does it create a conflict in your mind when people ask you, what do you do, Rahul?
No, it's not a conflict when I'm asked. I think to me the conflict is, how do I give all of this the kind of time that I would like to give it to? And also the other point is that then what happens to the time that you want to do nothing, right? Because from the nothing also comes a lot of the ideas, right? That's when you have that time to really, really think deeper. So the writing part, for example, even during COVID, I'm working on another book, and I haven't touched it since over a year and a half now, because I just don't have the energy and the ability to go back to it. So, for example, I love to keep writing. The coaching bit, again, I'd love to do more of it. But coming to your point about, I learned this interesting thing from a friend of mine who lives in Singapore, and he works for a company that is selling these workspace / modern boutique hotels to kind of millennials. And he's my age, so I always wanted to slap him because he keeps coming up with these buzzwords which the kids use. And apparently, when you're like a lawyer hyphen something, because that's the cool thing now, on their visiting cards apparently have, so they're called hyphenators. So maybe that's how you should answer this, that
I'm a hyphenator.
you're something hyphen something hyphen. So I guess that's kind of maybe where we're at. But no, I still see myself in terms of, from a 90% of my energy still goes into the restaurant business. I'd like it to and also, how do I then cross-pollinate the stuff, right? So I want to coach more people within my own company. I try to do that, but again, with mixed results, because I think they're too busy and they've got a million other priorities. But eventually, I'd like to continue to write. I would like to continue to stay in the food business and coach. But I don't know. It depends how much time I'd be able to
If
give
you
it,
could just increase 24 hours to 28, that would just
But
solve the
sometimes
problem.
I feel if we really want to, we can. But I think it's also then, you also don't want to completely, as it is as a personality, I'm very hard on myself. I'm always feeling I can do better, or So if I now start pushing myself even on this, then I'll just get more and more grumpy. So I need to be a little careful with this.
Yeah, I think kindness starts at home. I do agree with that.
Yeah.
And when you're a thinking person, you do want, you will have various interests and you will want to pursue them, I guess. Finding your priorities, I guess.
Yeah, like I was telling you even earlier before this chat, like I'm with a friend. I've been dying to do something with, like, even Manav, my photographer for the book. Him and I wanted to do something with short film, with small little podcasts. So there's all these thoughts, right? But I remember when I was a kid, my first trip to America, I barely left the hotel room because I just watched infomercials for hours. And my
cultural sort of
and my mum was just like, what is wrong with you, and I said, no, when I grow up I want to make ads, like this is what I want to do. So there's this part of me that luckily I get to do some of that branding and marketing in the restaurant space, but there's this other part of me that loves, even now I love the idea of advertising and creating stories and creating something out of nothing. Like, these guys would talk about a vacuum cleaner for 8 hours on these infomercials, and I'm like, how is this even possible? But that's America, right? So, but I always remember that, like, this idea of selling something out of nothing is very fascinating to me.
So tell me, what are you currently reading?
I mainly read a lot of non-fiction. So currently I wouldn't say currently, but one of my favorite books of the last 2-3 years. In fact, the reason I also got encouraged to write what I'm currently writing is a book called The Tender Bar by this guy called J.R. Mooringer. He's a very nondescript sort of...
I'm noting it down.
Yeah, he's just he's a journalist who basically talks about his autobiography, growing up without a father in a shitty part of New Jersey, basically. But the way it's written, it's brilliant. And he since has ghostwritten Andre Agassi's book. He's just ghostwritten Prince Harry's book. And he also ghostwrote Phil Knight's book, Shoe Dog.
Really?
Yeah.
So Shoe Dog's one of my
So if you like that
favorite
style of writing, the guy who wrote it, and the reason why Agassi and Prince Harry and everyone's sort of coming at him to write for him is that's his book. It's called The Tender Bar, because he grew up at a bar that his uncle used to run. And so I wanted to kind of write my coming of age story during COVID. That's what I'm working on now. Not necessarily to even publish it, but at worst I can just give it to my kids and say, listen, this is what went down. and kind of, enjoy it or throw it away. But yeah, so that would be one book I recently read that has stayed with me. Otherwise, I read a lot of history. Um, I read a lot of. So I'm trying to think of any other book that I've currently read that I've loved. Um, there's another autobiography I just recently read, which was on one of these bestsellers. It's called, written by a Taiwanese guy called Stay True. I forgot what his name is rather. That was quite nice also. But these were two autobiographical ones.
That kind of stayed or stayed
Yeah,
up with
yeah.
you.
I'm trying to. In fact, it's funny. None of the current non-fiction I've read recently has really stayed with me. But I'm reading one on colonialism, which I'm enjoying because it's called Colonialism: A Moral Reckoning, and he talks about just British colonialism across the world, and he talks about how a lot of the myths around colonialism aren't necessarily true. So it's a bit controversial. He's almost an apologist for it, but he's kind of looking at it from a moral compass. So, the things that we normally associate with colonialism, whether it's slavery or loot or, power, etc., etc. So each chapter kind of talks about one of those topics and he kind of dissects it. So I'm enjoying that, but I only get to read on aeroplanes now, which is a pain because people have forgotten that there's something called headphones on
Yeah,
aeroplanes.
so it's
So people
noisy.
just have random phones on the whole time, and you're that guy who's like, "Can I read in peace?" But yeah,
So one more thing I want to ask you, and I've faced it a little bit because my husband's from the food industry as well.
yeah,
But I think everyone I have met, young, middle aged, or older, has this aspiration of one day I'll quit my job and open a restaurant.
yeah,
And that seems to be the dream for a lot of youngsters.
yeah.
And what's the advice you would give them?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of vanity involved in this for some reason because I think it's also a very visible business, right? I mean, when was the last time if someone said, "Oh, I make cement,"
Yeah.
when was the last time you knew how well they were really doing, right? Or you thought if they were doing well? Because the restaurant business is very visible. You can walk down a mall and you can see one guy is full, one guy has two tables. You can kind of tell, okay, that probably makes money and this guy doesn't, right? So, but there's a lot of layers within layers in like any business, right? So for me, I'm quite discouraging, and sometimes people say that I'm trying to void off competition. That isn't the case. There's enough competition as it is, right? I just feel that you have to be extremely in love with the idea of not just the idea of telling your friends, "Oh, I have a restaurant," but whatever comes with it, right? How do you keep, like 90% of our workforce in India in the hospitality business is intrinsically demotivated. They don't want to be peeling garlic and chopping carrots and cleaning dishes, right? They'd rather be engineers in Hyderabad or somewhere. So how do you keep them motivated? How do you give them growth? How do you even relate to them? They're from Manipur, they're from all kind Orissa, from all kinds of places where they need growth, and that's why they're with you, right? So I think to deal with that, then to obviously also deal with a lot of your ego has to be put aside because you will be trashed every morning, right? So if you have issues with critics and issues with people giving you reviews, again, you have to have a thick skin, and you have to realize also why you're doing it. Like for us, we know we're doing this to build value with our investors, right? I'm not going to be passing this down to my children or my grandchildren. So, if you're doing it just for 6 months to open a nightclub and buy a fancy car, you can do that. But, what's your staying power? What's your overall idea and philosophy behind the business? So unless you don't totally think it through, if you're just doing it for vanity or because
It's the cool thing to do.
yeah, then because people also don't realize how many shut. Everybody just quotes like the big hits, right? So it's a hugely risky business. And it's, not something that I'd necessarily recommend for everybody. But yeah, it works for some because you also then have to be nuts, right? You're working on Diwali, you're working at Holi, you're working on New Year's Eve.
National holidays are peak
Yeah,
season.
yeah. And it's thankless because you start every day from zero. There's no fixed income here, right? It's like you have to keep running on the treadmill to kind of make sure you keep, evolving, you keep coming up with something new. So it's tiring. I would honestly marvel at people who are doing it past their 50th birthday. I genuinely feel like those are amazingly energetic people with a lot of patience and virtue. I don't see myself doing it for
Yeah, I know.
decades on.
I
Right?
know a very energetic 70-year-old
Yeah, it's
in
amazing.
Bangalore. He has multiple restaurants and bars,
It's
and
amazing.
he said that till 50 you're young, from 50 to 75 you're middle aged, and after 75 you're old, and that's why I'm still in the restaurant business.
Sounds like the guys we played tennis with, huh? At the gymkhana, but yeah.
Okay, one last question, Rahul, before I go. You mentioned children. What's the one sort of lesson you've learned after you had kids, or what has parenthood taught you?
I have the opposite thing. I just feel like stop over parenting. Like they're people. They'll figure it out. Just make sure they're in the lane. And if they drive a little bit here and there, you kind of nudge them, and that's it. I think there's too much over parenting. That's my view, and there's too much obsessiveness about your child. Like if my child's doing something, also the reaction of it. Like just the other day, I was telling my wife this. My younger one's about 14 months. He's the youngest in his preschool. He can barely walk. So I don't know why he's even there, but we send him there a couple of times a week. And he pitter patters and does his stuff. And I'm sometimes the only sort of parent there who's a male. And I just see some of the moms there and their reaction to what their kids are doing. And I just find them completely overreacting and over parenting. And I'm like, you're just already creating so many boundaries. So I don't know. And again, to me, parental advice is also a little bit like marital advice, because
Yeah, you have to figure out what
every
works for
marriage
you.
is different,
Yeah.
every kid's different. It's quite oxymoronic, right? To even say there's parental advice, because every kid comes with its own bag of tricks, right? And it's literally, you don't know what you're going to get. So I think I would just say hold back your initial reactions of over parenting and obsessiveness. Like, he's not the only kid in the world. He's one of the kids in the world, and he'll or she will figure out what the deal is, right?
No, I feel children teach us so much. Like, it's not so much about me parenting the kid, but just through the experience of being a parent, you learn curiosity and how.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just to see those small, like, bumps in the road where you feel like gradually now incrementally growing, like it's like I travel a fair bit, even like after 4 or 5 days of being away, I'll come back and I'll hear like 6 different words, or so there's this, in my head I'm like, okay, these are incremental gains, but I think let's see where this takes you, and also then just to see how siblings evolve, right? Like, my older one's about 5, and he's a very good older brother so far. I think he's doing phenomenally well. He's super patient and super caring. But the little one is pushing him. He's constantly challenging him with various things. Just to see that,
It's from siblings more than anyone else.
yeah, just to see that dynamic is very fascinating.
Just one quick question, Rahul. What advice would you give 20-year-olds today, knowing what you know about life and the restaurant business?
Stop thinking that you're so entitled. That's it. I just find this generation that they feel they're super entitled without any reason to be entitled. Like, my question to them is, please list, even on one hand, if you can give me 5 reasons on 5 fingers why you should be entitled, I'll have a conversation with you. Otherwise, get on with work and keep your head down and and also stop having such a thick skin. This idea of this woke culture of being offended so easily. There's a massive difference between being offended and being correct, and they don't realize what's what. And I think that's a major issue. If you think you're offended, that's one thing, but to think you're offended and that makes you correct is a whole different ballgame.
So basically, keep your head down, do the work, and don't think everything is going to come to you for granted.
Yeah, and stop being offended at the drop of a hat.
Got it. Well, thank you so much, Rahul. You're listening to Unbox with Tanvi, and we'll catch you again soon on another episode.